From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here. Thanks for joining us. During the first half of today's broadcast, a visit with K-State's Bill Schapaugh about the 2019 K-State Soybean Variety Performance Trials, the results of which now available to you soybean growers. Bill will go over what the performance tests told us about variety yield potential. He'll also discuss two special variety evaluations that were again conducted this past year, rating varieties for their resistance to soybean cyst nematodes and sudden death syndrome. Later, this week's horticulture feature, K-State's Cheryl Boyer on selecting ornamental plant material that's more prone to attracting bees and other pollinators to the landscape setting. Plus more, here on Agriculture Today.
What is radon? Home exposure to radon gas is the leading cause of lung cancer death in the United States for non-smokers. In Kansas, 1 in 4 homes will test at or above the EPA action level. The Surgeon General recommends all homes be tested and fixed if necessary. Visit kansasradonprogram.org for more information. Test, fix, save a life. This message brought to you by the Kansas Radon Program, the Kansas Association of Broadcasters, and this station.
Thanks for tuning in once again. You are listening to the K-State Radio Network and our Thursday edition of Agriculture Today. Welcome once more. Well, good news in that the K-State 2019 Soybean Variety Performance Trials are all wrapped up. Of course, it's been a very odd year for crop production in general with the weather conditions that were. But that data is now all collected at long last and available to you producers. We'll talk about that and some of the findings in this year's round of tests. Joining us once more is soybean breeder at Kansas State University, Bill Schapaugh, to let us know more about what's been going on in those trials this past year. Variety selection, as you've always maintained, Bill, is highly important, obviously, to good soybean productivity.
Well, certainly. It's a complicated process, but this is one component that the growers can use to help make an appropriate decision.
Well, tell us about the size and scope of this year's trials around Kansas, if you would.
Well, we had in 2019, there were 100 varieties entered in the trials. We had 12 different companies or programs submitted entries. Those included the University of Missouri. They provided both some conventional and Roundup Ready 1 varieties. Corteva had some entries, GDM Seeds, Golden Harvest, LG Seeds, MFA Incorporated, Midland, Monsanto, Phillips Seed Farms, Stratton Seeds, Willcross, and we had some K-State varieties in there as well. So a good group. Most of the entries, most of the varieties were Roundup Ready Extend varieties. We had Liberty Link. The Liberty Link varieties have been in there for several years, and they continue to have a few of entries there. We still had a few Roundup Ready 1 entries and a few conventional varieties. And then new this year we had a few Enlist varieties for the first time.
And those were put through the paces at, you say, 13 tests around the state?
At 13. We lost a few. And we lost a few, as you mentioned, the weather. We really had excessive, certainly adequate to excessive rainfall at these locations. Most of the sites had upwards of 50% or more rainfall than the 30-year average. So it was wet, and we had some poor stands at some sites, and even in some cases good stands, but poor growth after they did come up because of the rainfall. So we lost sites at the McCune. That was looking like a really good test, but it was just too wet. We lost also down southeast Kansas the double crop test over near Pittsburgh. That was a no-till test. Basically planted in saturated soil conditions, and it stayed pretty much saturated for 3 or 4 months after emergence, so it did poorly. And then we also had a poor stand and weed control up at Scandia. So we lost those 3, but everything else came in, and really everything else had very good yields, certainly above average yields, above the trend line and what we've been seeing in the performance tests the last few years.
Might fill us in a bit on test procedures here, how you put those varieties through the paces.
Well, their trial locations are anywhere from northeast Kansas, a few locations, all the way down southeast Kansas, and then central Kansas and northwest Kansas. The agronomists that handle these sites, all the entries are put into one test, okay, regardless of whether they have or haven't got specific herbicide traits. We put them all in there so you can compare them all. They're all handled by the same management practices. They're all handled basically as conventional varieties. Growers then can look at basically the yield potential of all this material. And to keep this all straight, we do in the reports, with the variety name, have a column where we put the herbicide trait, if they have that in there, or the traits of that variety, so growers can make sure they keep those straight when they're looking at that information.
Very good. As far as results, and you mentioned the growing conditions and some of the hurdles that had to be cleared there, excessive precipitation in some places, but ample otherwise. Were the temperatures much of a factor in this year's trials?
Not too much. I mean, it got pretty warm. The peak temperatures were mid-July. And we had, in general, the tests were planned a little bit late to, a few weeks later than normal. In our breeding program, for example, we planted almost of all of our tests, and the performance tests here, the sites that we planted, they were all done first couple of weeks of June. That pushed growth and development a little farther into August and September. It was still warm, and it still kind of dried out a little bit in August and early September. So we had some of the environmental conditions factored there. But overall, temperatures weren't above average, which is generally detrimental to the growth and development. So that was good. Freezes, the fall freezes or autumn freezes were basically on schedule, about near average. But we had, some of the plants, because of either late planting or some of the double crop, was still a little bit of ways from maturity or R8. And so some of the performance was certainly impacted by some of the cooler temperatures in the fall.
But not dramatically, so it doesn't sound.
Right, not dramatically. Right? The yields were still pretty darn high.
Well, let's talk about the yields, and you just suggested a moment ago that there were some numbers that weren't too bad at all, but talk in more specifics about what was trending in those yields.
Well, if you looked at the USDA has forecasted or did forecast in November the Kansas yield at 44 bushels per acre. The tests and the yields in the performance tests tend to be a little bit above average. I mean, we look at the sites and they're nice and uniform. We're trying to pick good soil conditions and so on, but they were very very much above that this year. If you look at our all of our sites, all 13, both the 9 dryland sites and the 4 irrigated trials, they all averaged 61 bushels per acre. Both sites, dryland and irrigated. So yields were high. And really, if you look at the performance test and you look at Kansas yields the last several years, the yields have been high. So very good range in performance of the varieties.
So one can compare varieties and get a pretty good idea with those overall high yields as were recorded in the test this past year. There's lots of information available in the report to cover all aspects of varietal productivity then?
Yeah, and so obviously you've got the yield levels, and like I said, there's a good range in yields. If you look at the varieties with the best 3-year averages, their mean yields range from the upper 40s at Assyria, location over near Salina, a dryland site, to average yields over the 3 years in the 70 bushels. And that's our highest yielding sites the last couple of years have been Cairo, which is just a little bit west of Topeka, and then down at Ottawa in east central Kansas. So good yields, high yield, average yields. The highest yielding varieties in the test tend to have yields 5 to 10 bushels above the test average. So something for producers to really go after. So that performance is reported for 2019, and then if any of the entries that have been in the trials in previous years, 2017 or 18, those results are also in the report.
So be looking for all of that information, lodging, plant height, maturity information. It's all there in the report. And something else that we do want to highlight here, Bill, actually two things. You and your colleagues in the department have conducted special evaluations for two disease concerns that can really eat into those yield potentials of the varieties, soybean cyst nematode and sudden death syndrome. Bill, you have a pretty big plate of information there, and we do want to allow enough time to get into all of that, so we'll pick up on that right after the break. Bill Schapaugh is our guest, soybean breeder, K-State Research and Extension, as we're sifting through the results of K-State's 2019 Soybean Variety Performance Trials. Those have just been posted for you producers to make full use of. Before we break away here, might slip this in that K-State's latest round of soybean production schools for you producers are all lined up now. They are taking place during this month of January at 6 locations around Kansas. These are sponsored by the Kansas Soybean Commission, by the way. They are half-day schools covering lead issues that you bean producers contend with. Each school will feature these topics: weed control, crop production, soil fertility and nutrient management, insect control, disease management, and the soybean market outlook. The locations and dates for the 6 schools, 3 of them are coming up next week. This coming Monday, January the 13th, at 2 locations, Smith Center, 9:30 that morning, and then at 3:30 in the afternoon on Monday at Salina. The next day, Tuesday, January the 14th, then, there will be a school at Mulvane. Then the following week, Tuesday, January the 21st, at Emporia, and on Wednesday, January the 22nd, another pair of schools, one at Atchison, 9:30 in the morning, and the other at Marysville at 3 o'clock that afternoon. There will be a complimentary meal at each of these locations, no cost to attend, but they're asking you to pre-register as soon as possible for your chosen location at the respective extension offices in Smith, Saline, Sumner, Lyon, Atchison, and Marshall counties. So capitalize on those opportunities. The K-State Soybean Production Schools coming up over the next couple of weeks around Kansas. Again, we'll return with K-State's Bill Schapaugh shortly here on Agriculture Today.
Kansas farmers and ranchers are helping feed your family in the world. The largest contributor to the Kansas economy is beef cattle. How do you get that juicy steak on your plate? In order for you to enjoy your tasty meal, it requires the hard work of the producers, marketers, advertisers, processors, inspectors, transporters, packers, and consumers. So thank all these people and sit back, relax, and enjoy your tasty meal.
We're back now on Agriculture Today, and once more, Mike's side, soybean breeder Bill Schapaugh of Kansas State University. Bill has joined us today to lift highlights from the just completed K-State 2019 Soybean Variety Performance Test report. Once again, that is now available to you growers as you go about your soybean variety selection decisions here in the coming weeks and months. Bill, earlier we addressed in general the basic soybean yield evaluations that you conducted at the 13 tests around the state of Kansas this past year. But there is a pair of specialized bean variety evaluations that you also run routinely now, and we wanted to give those a direct look as well. Again, assessing varieties for their tolerance of 2 leading and very detrimental conditions out there: soybean cyst nematodes and soybean sudden death syndrome. Fill us in on what you have along those lines for producers to consider.
Right. We've been focusing on those for a number of years. Soybean cyst nematode, that's really the focus of Tim Todd and Tom Oakley with the plant pathology department. They take all the entries in the test, and they subject them to an evaluation of how well soybean cyst nematodes reproduce on the seedlings of those plants, of those varieties. And they usually do 2 or 3 different SCN populations. SCN, that particular pest, is a very genetically diverse organism. Populations from one field to the next can vary. And so they try to capture some of that variation and response of the plants to soybean cyst by evaluating the plants grown in different soybean SCN populations. They're referred to as HG types. And this past year, they evaluated all the varieties to 3 different HG types. So what we report, and this information is on the agronomy website, which under the 2019 results, and we'll give you that here later. But their report was referred to as the female index. And it's a ratio of the number of cysts growing on the roots of a particular variety divided by the number of cysts that are on a check variety, a control variety that is susceptible to that particular population of nematode. Okay, so for example, if a variety was given a female index of 100, that would mean that the number of cysts growing on that variety is similar to the number of cysts that are growing on a susceptible check variety, which would be a bad thing. Okay? It would be a negative impact on that particular variety. So lower values are better. Lower values have higher levels of resistance. And in the reports, the values usually range anywhere from 0, meaning there weren't any cysts produced on that variety, which is not very common, but it can happen, to maybe up to around 200, meaning that the variety had twice as many cysts as a susceptible variety, so it was very susceptible. So that's what they report. And so you've got columns and numbers of these female indices, and you're looking for varieties that have low numbers in response to all the populations. And they vary greatly within a population and among populations, and a variety can be very susceptible to all the populations. It can be fairly resistant to some populations and susceptible to others. So it just depends. So I'll give you an example. This year's results, 2019, I have one entry here that had female indices to the 3 populations of 104, 101, and 114. So pretty susceptible. But you can contrast this. That's one of the poor or least resistant varieties. Contrast that to one of the more resistant varieties, and it had female indices of 5, 1, and 30. Oh. Okay, that's low, very good. And so really, ideally, the grower would try to find varieties that are resistant to multiple races and tend to have values, a female index of 30 or under. Not really good reproductive rates. Once you get up into the 70s and 80s and 150 values for female indices, there's a potential for that nematode really to reproduce well and for the population to build in the soil. And as the population builds, the potential for yield loss increases.
So if a producer has been contending with SCN recent seasons, they can take those values, cross-reference them with the yield values of those given varieties as they've identified them, help them make a decision on varietal selection that way.
One characteristic to look at.
Talk about the other work against sudden death syndrome, a dramatically devastating disease where it sets in on soybean plants.
Right. It can be very dramatic. And so what we did this year on that is Eric Adey, he's over at the Kansas River Valley Experiment Field by Topeka. He handles 2 of these tests this year. One's irrigated, one's dryland. He didn't really have much soybean sudden death in the dryland site over by Cairo, but at the Topeka site in Shawnee County, the irrigated site, he had a substantial amount of SDS. So he takes visual ratings for that, and as the disease progresses, and if it really influences yield, what it actually causes the plant to do is senesce. A toxin kills tissue, kills the leaf tissue, and the plant dies. And it can be very late in the growing season, very late in the growth and development of the plant, but it actually can be pretty early. It can be relatively shortly after flowering. So he goes out and when he starts to see the disease, he takes visual ratings, and over the course of the time between then and between maturity, he's rated it multiple times, and he comes up with a rating we call the area under the disease curve, AUDC for short. That number can range from 0 up into the hundreds or in the thousands, depending upon what he sees and when he sees it. But a low number means low disease or no disease, and a high number is relatively more disease. And so we report that, and we've got that in with the agronomy website under the 2019 test, along with yield, maturity, lodging, and height. And this year, his ratings, these AUDC ratings, range from 35 to 1,257.
Now, that's quite a spectrum, isn't it?
Quite a spectrum. And he has, and the precision of this is pretty good. He had an LSD value of 250. So several-fold difference in the values for this AUDC. Well, what did that mean? That didn't mean anything. Well, take a look at that. If you look at that, those values, and then you couple that with yield, okay? The average yield for the test was 63 bushels per acre. It ranged from 40 bushels per acre up to 76 bushels per acre. Well, let's compare that with the AUDC values. Well, the 76 bushel per acre entry in the test, that variety had an AUDC of 111. Okay, it wasn't zero, but it was a long ways from 1,000. Okay, now let's take a look at the lowest yielding entry, 40 bushels. That had an AUDC value of 1,105. Okay,
so this is showing the relevance of these numbers.
Correct. And in this data set here, there's a fairly substantial relationship between yield and SDS symptoms, and that occurs pretty much most years at Topeka. Okay, so something to keep an eye out. Just because a variety did real well and has a low AUDC this year doesn't mean it may be low next year. We have to keep track of that. And just because it did poorly this year doesn't mean that it might not do better next year. But it is something to keep track of. And there was a big difference in response to soybean sudden death at this site this year, and that is reflected in his AUDC ratings, and it is reflected in the yield values he got at that test.
And again, producers, these varietal evaluations for sudden death syndrome resistance or soybean cyst nematode vulnerability can be found within the K-State Soybean Performance Test report, which we keep referencing. And again, as producers, Bill, look at all of this that you've talked about today, you want to still encourage them to use this as but one of many resources as they go about their varietal selection.
Absolutely. I mean, I know producers that have test plots on their farm and do some of their own research on this. There's county plots, seed companies, seed dealers. They have information that willing to share with the other farmers, networking. So other state trials might come into play depending on your location. So lots of places to get information. New varieties are coming out. Over half the varieties in the test this year are new this year. It's just the way it's been for quite a while now. It's the way it's going to continue to be. There's high turnover varieties. It's challenging, but varieties continue to prove. Yield's creeping up, genetic potential keeps creeping up, and it's important to try to stay abreast of that.
Without a doubt. But do include, by all means, this new information in the form of K-State's 2019 Soybean Variety Performance Test. The results can be found many ways at agronomy.ksu.edu right now under the Crop Performance Tests link, also through the High Plains Journal, and insert in that publication coming soon, and through local extension offices. Or at the K-State Research and Extension bookstore online, bookstore.ksre.ksu.edu. Great work, as always, on the part of you and your team, Bill. Thanks for the full report right here, and we appreciate the update.
Thank you, Eric.
Soybean breeder at Kansas State University. That's Bill Schapaugh. Again, take full advantage of this wealth of information on soybean variety performance from various vantage points and angles as captured in the aforementioned report. You're listening to Agriculture Today.
Did you know every Kansas farmer feeds 128-plus people?
Kansas farmers are hard workers, dependable, authentic, and sensitive.
Not only do farmers put food on your table, but they put clothes on your back and fuel in your car.
For more information about Kansas farmers, visit K-State Research and Extension online or stop by your local extension office. This message has been brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
Next for you on Agriculture Today, our weekly horticulture segment, and more along the theme of planning ahead to lawn and garden activities you can take on come springtime, and this time looking at landscape ornamental selection. Cheryl Boyer has joined us once again. She's an ornamental horticulturist with K-State Research and Extension, and we're zeroing in on planting to attract pollinators. Bees and others have garnered a great deal of attention in recent years, Cheryl.
They sure have. It's really been a national issue from a lot of different perspectives. I mean, everybody is trying to save the pollinators and play a role and be a part of the solution for some of the challenges that our honeybees experience. And we do have a lot of expertise here at K-State to help with some of those challenges if you are a beekeeper. But a lot of people want to know, what can I do if I don't necessarily want to have a beehive, but I want to support pollination so that I have a wider variety of food to eat myself.
And strategic landscaping can contribute to that, is your point here.
That's right. So, there have been lots of publications over the years about plants for pollinators, and many of them center around perennials that bloom in the summer and are sort of traditionally thought of as pollinators. But I recently did a literature review to see what's new in the area of pollinators and ornamentals and selecting plants for that part of life that supports the food web that eventually supports us, and how each of us can play a role in our own yards in that process.
And we want to get into this, but are there standard plant traits that are encouraging to pollinators, so to speak?
There are. And, I don't think that that's really been talked about a lot. Some of this is fairly new knowledge. There's been quite a bit of debate about whether or not it's better to have native plants versus non-native plants. And some of the new research has actually compared the two directly, which has been really beneficial for those of us who are recommending plants for pollinators. So in one particular study, they actually put a straight species right next to, in a garden situation, right next to a cultivar. And so they had cultivated varieties that are selected for different characteristics, usually ornamental. So sometimes that means that they have interesting characteristics in their bloom or their bark or their leaves. So a lot of times that shows up as plants with purple leaves or plants with variegation, which means they have more than one color on the leaf, or their form is more consistent than maybe the natural species that hasn't been selected for anything. So they actually compared them directly next to each other and collected samples, collected the pollinators that fed on them, measured how much those plants were eaten on, and they did a lot of comparisons to see if there were any trends in that data.
And were there trends? Were there features that really contribute to the cause?
There were. So they actually looked at quite a few different characteristics. So they looked at leaf color, variegation, fall color, habit, disease resistance, fruit size, and then compared those with their wild type. And the main thing that they found was that if you are gardening for pollinator sustenance, pollinators were less attracted to cultivars that had like a red or a purple leaf color, which is really popular these days with some of the newer plants. They're not bad plants, and I think that there's a place for both types of plants in the garden. They're beautiful, but if your main purpose is to provide a food source for pollinators, that might not be the best choice, which is really interesting. And the authors speculated that it may have something to do with anthocyanins in the leaves, so it doesn't taste as good, or insects see color differently than we do, so it might just not attract them. They might see it differently. So that was a main finding, although they did find in one part of the study that leaf variegation was not a deterrent to insects. So it's mainly that dark purple color. And in general, if I'm going to talk about what you should plant in your yard, I like to keep those strikingly colored plants to a minimum so that they really stand out as sort of a specimen plant anyway. So I like that advice.
So beyond those limitations, elsewhere along the color spectrum will typically work as an attractant to pollinators. Is that correct?
That's true. And what was interesting to me, there was another study that actually looked at pollinators that visited natives and non-natives to see what type of pollinators visited them, and then they actually collected samples of the pollen to see how nutritious it was for a pollinator, because if it's not nutritious, then the pollinators have to feed more frequently. So we want to be giving them ornamental plants that they can really thrive on. What surprised me was that the results were mixed. So there were both natives and non-natives that had lots of pollinators or hardly any pollinators. And there were natives and non-natives that had really good food sources and some that it wasn't that great. So it was just a mixed bag. But the key, really, if you think about it from an insect's perspective, is they want a big, wide, open flower I mean, it doesn't have to be huge, but it needs to be open because some of our pollinators have relatively big bodies and they need to be able to get in there to feed. So that means that some of these cultivars that have double petals, so they're really tight, like roses, and they've got lots and lots of petals, sometimes those are difficult for insects to get in and feed on. So again, I think there's room in our landscapes for both types of plants, but it's nice to have a mix so that pollinators have a buffet to choose from.
And taking that one further, there's some thinking out there that having something available year-round is important. So as you put together that mix of plants, you need to think in those terms, you say?
Yeah, that's a really good point. So for those of you who are listening on the radio, we do have some really good resources at K-State Research and Extension, some in the bookstore. You can download them for free online. There's a publication about monarch butterflies. In it, there is a list of plants, and in all of the publications that I found, many of the plant lists are organized by bloom season, making a food source available as soon as you possibly can. And that starts with spring bulbs like crocus and daffodil. And there's a recent study out of Arkansas that looked at planting bulbs in grasses to see how they would survive if you let the bulbs come up and do their thing and then let them die back down before you start regular lawn maintenance, and how well they would come back year after year and feed pollinators. And so daffodils were pretty high on that list, and those are really good for naturalizing. So in the summer, there's lots of food sources, but I don't think very many people are thinking about feeding our pollinators in February or March when those types of plants are coming up. So there's a lot of really good things out there, and I think some options that we maybe haven't talked a lot about in terms of how to support our food web and how everyone can play a role.
Cheryl, great idea as folks think about enhancing their landscapes in the coming year. Appreciate your time, as always.
You're welcome.
She's an extension ornamental horticulturist at Kansas State University. Is Cheryl Boyer. Cheryl's been our guest on this week's horticulture segment. Our time once more is away. Thanks for listening in. Eric Atkinson for Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.